And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
He was the first modern president. He was the first president born in the 20th century. But more importantly, he didn't look like your grandfather. He looked like a dapper young man in your hometown. He had a beautiful wife. Let's remember at the time of the assassination that Jacqueline Kennedy was only in her early 30s. He had these two gorgeous kids. He had an aura about him that Americans had never seen in a president. And he certainly was the first president of the television age, and he took full advantage of that. Not only him, but obviously his wife. And there was certainly a Camelot era and mystique around the Kennedys that still exists to this day.
Don't let it be forgot that once there was a spot for one brief shining moment. That was known as
All his times were happy until he went to Dallas.
My day started in a very ordinary way. I was the senior diplomatic correspondent for CBS.
Well, I was in the 5th grade on November 22nd, 1963, and my homeroom teacher in Perry knew that I had a fascination and interest in politics and history and current events.
I was at Broadcasting Publications up on DeSale Street at the time, and coming back from lunch. And one of the secretaries in our advertising department was just coming out to lunch, and she said, I don't know where to go to, I don't know if I'm going to eat. Why? What happened to her? She said, didn't you hear that President Kennedy's been killed?
So in the middle of the afternoon, she took me aside and quietly told me what had happened just an hour or two before in Dallas. As far as I know, I was probably the only student in my school who knew what had happened before we left school that day.
Then I picked up the phone and called the office and overheard the voice of Alan Jackson, who was one of our senior anchors on radio, saying 3 shots had been fired at Dealey Plaza, the president's motorcade. And something inside me said, he's been shot and he's been killed. And I knew that I would have to broadcast immediately. But I also knew that I couldn't.
It was really stunning. It stunned you, stunned me, all of us. The rest of the day was changed. We didn't know what was doing, what was going to happen.
I was stunned into a kind of emotional paralysis. And I decided on the most unprofessional thing I've ever done in my life, which was I left the State Department and walked around the building for about 10 minutes until I could compose myself. And then I was okay. And I went back in and the phone rang and it was my boss saying the equivalent of, "Where have you been?" And I didn't answer his question, and he said, get down here immediately, and we've got some work to do.
Well, when the final bell rang, I bounded down the steps of the old WPA building that we were housed in, and I ran the entire block and a half to our family home. And once there, I burst through the front door, intending to tell my mother what had happened. Well, as soon as I got in, I heard dirge or funeral music playing on WKY radio, which she listened to every afternoon, and it certainly didn't play dirge or funeral music on a Friday afternoon in normal circumstances. Well, I wheeled through the living room and then entered into the kitchen, where I found her crying at the table, and it was obviously then that she knew what had happened.
The assassination of the president unleashed a decade of violence, upheaval, of a social and political sort that, of course, this country has had before, but it was stunning as it took place.
The escalation of the Vietnam War, of the riots throughout the major cities in this country, of the murders in 1968, just 60 days apart, of the Reverend Martin Luther King and the president's brother, Senator Robert F. Kennedy. After that, in the 1970s, you had the Arab oil embargoes, 2 embargoes, in fact, the cataclysmic events of the first resignation of the president that was caused by Watergate. And I would contend to you that this era of upheaval lasted really 17 years until the release of the Iranian hostages on January 20th, 1981.
And so the entire country seemed to have been unleashed or unloosed immediately upon Kennedy's death.
Unbelievable series of circumstances, arresting of Lee Harvey Oswald and his assassination on television. Television came to its own as a news medium and as an instant report on what's happening. It hasn't changed. Television used to stop at midnight, start about 7 o'clock in the morning. Now it's 24 hours. The news cycle is 24 hours. And if it's news, you turn on your television.
The most profound change in American journalism took place that weekend, from the Friday that Kennedy was killed to the Monday when he was buried at Arlington. Television in those 4 days grew up, and it became a mature and serious source of news. Up to that point, it had not been thought of that way. So television grew up, and it became the single most important means of communication in the United States and all over the world. So the impact on journalism was immense. And the impact that television then had on American politics was equally immense.
Well, certainly television in 1963 was still a new medium. Most Americans really didn't buy a television until sometime in the 1950s. And so at the time, it was print and radio, particularly AM radio, that were the primary sources of news and breaking news for many Americans. But obviously, television's performance on that weekend, those 4 days from November 22nd through the funeral in Washington on Monday afternoon, November 25th, just absolutely captivated this country in its grief and its collective horror. And after that, it was clear that television would never be the same again. That television news then became the primary vehicle for news and information for generations of Americans to come.
As for 50 years from now or 100 years from now, I wouldn't hazard to, I wouldn't try, I wouldn't attempt, because I'd just be, I don't know.
I think that by the time 2063 rolls around, which will be 100 years, of course, after the assassination, that a lot of this will have faded, and for the simple reason that many Americans, myself included, who were young at the time, will be gone by then. I do think, though, that the fascination around the crime itself will continue. Whether the mystique of the Kennedys will continue, I sort of doubt that. But I do think the fact that we'll never really know for sure exactly what happened leading up to the days in Dallas. Was Lee Harvey Oswald, did he act alone? I personally believe that he did act alone. But there are many Americans who don't believe that way, and they could be dissuaded into believing even more than the 60% today. Perhaps 50 years from now, that percentage might be 80% or so, who knows. So there'll still be plenty of people talking about it, but I'm not sure it will be talked about at the same level it is today.
The Kennedy record, the legend of Kennedy, the mystique of Kennedy, almost the myth of Kennedy, has lived on so powerfully in American culture and political life that we have accepted it as a major fact, and we deal with Kennedy as a great president, but he might not have been a great president, really. And maybe by 2063, the historians will come in with a judgment that he was a very popular president, but that his presidency was unfinished. We don't know exactly what would have happened.